there's a cycle that's repeated whenever Hansen comes out with some important work. And I think some of Hansen's work is some of the most important in climate science today. There is a noticeable cycle. He'll put out a major paper. There'll be a flurry of news, and the mainstream media will interview the same people, and they'll say, well, Hansen's got some interesting stuff, but our models show that he's overdoing it, sort of thing. They'll never refer directly to what is in Hansen's papers, but there's often ad hominem attacks and calling he's the outlier, the lone wolf, etc.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. I'll be your host and moderator today. And today we're diving into a new paper by what many consider the world's most experienced and most preeminent climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen, along with Pushkar Karecha, and it's titled Seeing the Forest for the Trees. It was just published on August 6th of this year, so it's fresh off the publication lines. Dr. Hansen is, of course, as many of you know, first raised the climate alarm on global warming back in 1988. And in this paper, he gives us a powerful yet important summary of his recent work, distilling two major papers into a clear message for scientists, policymakers, and all of us fighting for a livable climate. The paper is a synthesis of his 2023 study, Global Warming in the Pipeline, and this year's Global Warming has accelerated. But don't let that fool you. It's a wake-up call, sharpening the urgency of two critical findings that we'll be talking about. First, with over 99% confidence, he shows that Earth's climate sensitivity, which is how much warming we get from a doubling of CO2, he believes and shows is around 4.5 degrees Celsius, much higher than the IPCC's 3-degree estimate. That means we're facing much more severe warming than current plans account for, and making the Paris Agreement's 1.5 target all but impossible. Second, the paper highlights how we've underestimated the cooling effect of aerosols, those particles from pollution that block sunlight. And he talks about that it's a much more significant factor in what's happening on the planet than, again, most conventional science suggests. In fact, he is quite critical, not for the first time, of mainstream science. He pulls no punches, critiquing the IPCC for relying too heavily on models that miss these dynamics. And he actually calls out a scientific clique that downplays these findings there. So today we'll unpack these findings, exploring why they're stirring debate, and ask our guests, our experts who are here week after week with the best and latest information, what do we need to do to turn these proposals and conclusions into action? Policy, litigation, public pressure. So with that, let's get on with this, and I'm happy to introduce our first climate expert, our regular, Paul Beckwith, who is sitting outdoors, we see, with a nice green penumbra behind him, and I guess what is probably some coffee in his cup. Paul, as
May-
you know, is a climate system scientist from Ottawa. He's taught in a number of universities there, and he's well known to millions literally around the planet for his YouTube videos that cover every aspect of climate. And Paul, I know you know Dr. Hansen. You've talked with him, you've met with him, you've read all of his papers. So, what do you make of this latest kind of a sort of a summary paper, but a paper that also has some new features in it?
Yes, well, thank you, Herb. And yeah, this is copy, but after reading James's latest work, maybe something stronger is warranted. So basically, what Hansen is saying is that the overall temperature change we can expect from doubling CO2 is going to the equilibrium state that will eventually reach, and there is a lag period to reach that, will be 4.5 Celsius higher, as opposed to 3 degrees Celsius higher, which is what the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's the number that mainstream science uses. It's a number that is bantied about at climate conferences, et cetera. Hansen's main argument is that the 3.0 number is derived from global climate models and many, many different global climate models where there are some different parameters which can cancel each other out and therefore give you erroneous results. And what he's saying is that they're coming out with a 3 Celsius number for doubling CO2, but only because that they have the aerosol effect, namely the indirect aerosol effect of aerosols on cloud generation, the number of clouds there are, saying that both of them are incorrect and they're canceling each other out. He really criticizes the UN and the IPCC and the mainstream scientists for relying almost exclusively on global climate models, these GCMs. So Hansen's approach, and he says they're wrong with a 99% certainty, which is quite a statement for somebody to make. Hansen's relying his work and getting his 4.5 Celsius for climate sensitivity on three different independent methods, which he says he's getting agreement in. The first one is paleoclimate or long-term climate records. Mostly of the emphasis is on the temperature difference between the last glacial period on the planet. So we had the last glacial maximum, the LGM, which peaked. It was the coldest about 21,000 years ago when ice covered lots of North America and the Northern Hemisphere. So the temperature at that time versus the temperature pre-industrial today. So the temperature is 1750, 1800. That temperature difference, of course, it will incorporate all the feedbacks of the Earth system. So that's one factor, which he says points him to the 4.5 degrees Celsius number. The second one is modern observations. The climate models and mainstream scientists were flabbergasted when global temperatures set massive records spiking in the last several years, 2023, 2024, in fact, reached 1.6 degrees Celsius, blowing away any guard band of 1.5. They couldn't explain it. They were flabbergasted, but Hansen's work explains it in the aerosols, namely the aerosols in commercial shipping fuels, which were cut in 2016, 2017 significantly, and then they were down to like 3.5%, and then they were cut from 3.5% to 0.5% in 2020. And then you can see the spiking temperatures over shipping lanes, and there's lots of papers coming out confirming that it is actually that has a huge impact on the warming spike. And then the third thing is Hansen does use climate models extensively as well. But when you put in what he says is the proper climate sensitivity, 4.5, and the proper aerosol forcing indirect effects, and then he can model what's happening now, what the spikes in the last couple of years because of the reduction of aerosols. So he's building a very complete and coherent picture. The bottom line is the Earth is a darker place. In 2000, the overall reflectivity of the Earth system was 29.35%. In 2025 is 28.7%. The Earth is a lot darker. It's absorbing a lot more solar radiation. So climate change, global warming is accelerating rapidly, and this doesn't bode well. It's going to be, it's high time for mainstream science community, the IPCC, UN to all figure out the error of their ways and actually, let people know what's really happening like Hansen is.
Well, that's a lot you packed into a couple minutes, Paul, and we'll be discussing many of his observations and your reflections on his observations. So I guess when we talk about the Earth is darkening, getting warmer, it's just like on a hot day, if we put something dark around our skin, we put a black t-shirt, then we get warmer. And maybe I'm oversimplifying, but this is happening on average all over the planet for a variety of reasons that Dr. Hansen and his colleagues discuss briefly in the paper and in more depth in their previous papers. So, with that, I'm happy as always to introduce our expert from the other side of Canada, from British Columbia, Dr. Peter Carter. Peter is a retired medical doctor who is the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute He's been an expert reviewer for the IPCC. And as always, we're eager to hear your perspective on someone that you also know, Dr. Jim Hansen. What is he saying and why is it important for us to understand it? Peter.
So thank you, Herb. Yeah, it's always a great pleasure to refer to the work of James Hansen because certainly in my view, there's no doubt that he has been the very best communicator on the accurate facts of the climate science. And that brings me to, of course, the title for this latest paper that we're talking about, which is Global Warming Has Accelerated. The United Nations and the public will inform. So the obvious answer, I believe, is no. They're barely informed at all. With regards to the UN and the scientists, the science organizations, it's all left to the IPCC assessments. But it's pretty well known that the IPCC assessments underestimate and understate the dangers and impacts of global climate change. So we need a more formal communication of the science by the science organizations, presumably. Now, years ago, James Hansen was writing to the heads of governments and trying to explain to them that how things really were, that we really were in a planetary emergency. I really respect him again for doing all that. But he does that, of course, as a private citizen with knowledge about climate change. The public, how are they being informed? No, the science, such as the public might get to read, is pretty well always confusing. And we probably have the worst ever extreme heat and fires and drought all combined right across Europe. I've only come across one media report that mentioned climate change, only one. And that was from a source that's well known for focusing on climate change very well. So no, the public's not informed on the aerosol situation. As I understand it, and I looked into this some time ago, the radiative forcing, it's the aerosol radiative forcing, the negative forcing, switched to relative positive forcing in 2000. And that actually fits with China making very big steps to reduce its air pollution because its cities were killing people. So that was the start of the whole thing. And then, of course, we got the reduction of air pollution from the improvement, the regulations of the maritime shipping industry. Now, one thing that tends to be missed is what is the problem? Well, the problem is the fossil fuel industry. That is the problem. That really isn't being communicated very well at all. I mentioned Europe, the fossil fuel industry, fossil fuel emissions, they're not being mentioned at all. One mention of climate change, no mention of fossil fuels. And of course, this whole dilemma, this whole problem with the aerosols, that's a result of continuing to burn and emit fossil fuels because the aerosols, air pollution aerosols, acid, mostly sulfate aerosols that are cooling. And that we've known for decades and decades and decades. The really big thing, I guess, that stood out for me in this paper is James Hansen and his team. That this wasn't just James Hansen. There were at least a dozen other scientists with him. I don't know that we communicate that well enough. This is a very big number of scientists when they publish these James Hansen-led papers. So they really should get more attention, I think, is the AMOC. So I gather from reading the paper, they did a fresh model on the fresh water and the what's happening in Greenland and the Arctic. And they came to the conclusion from their model, which they seem very certain about, that AMOC will collapse, and it will collapse before 2050. Now, that is a massive difference from the IPCC. The IPCC has for years and years and years said that, well, AMOC might be slowing, we don't know, but it's not going to collapse. Well, that's hardly the point, The end point is not collapse because the AMOC slowing changes the climate of the northern hemisphere. It's doing that as long as it's slowing because it's changing dynamics.
Thank you, Peter. You presented, as you always do, a whole range of issues that should concern any informed or even uninformed citizen. The potential collapse of the AMOC, the fact that Dr. Hansen's views are not being considered by world leaders, or in many cases, even other scientists. He seems, and I'll turn it over to Paul for your perspective on this, to be as sort of he, and as you pointed out, along with a dozen or so of his colleagues, so he's certainly not the only one, but nonetheless, he seems to be isolated, a kind of a lone wolf in many respects, with his views on the climate, and they don't seem to be given the weight that other scientists are given. And given the critical nature of what he's saying and the implications for the survival of humanity in the natural world, it seems extremely problematic, to say the least, that that's the case. So, Paul, any additional thoughts that you have?
Yes, I agree completely with you, Herb, about you know how people, the mainstream media, they have their go-to mainstream scientists in quotes. There's a cycle that's repeated whenever Hansen comes out with some important work, and I think some of Hansen's work is some of the most important in climate science today. I would rank it up there, number one, or in top 10, everything he says about climate. There is a noticeable cycle. He'll put out a major paper, like one of the two major papers that he discussed in this letter. There'll be a flurry of news on the day the paper is released, and the mainstream media will interview the same people. It's a handful of white men, climatologists, that they go to, and they'll talk to them and they'll say, well, Hansen's got some interesting stuff, but our models show that, he's overdoing it, sort of thing. They'll never refer directly to what is in Hansen's papers, but there's often ad hominem attacks and calling, he's the outlier, the lone wolf, etc. So it's pathetic to see, actually. It's sort of indicative of how, a lot of media works in today's world. So, I would say that if I was a betting person, I would definitely go all in on James Hansen and his results and what he is saying. I mean, he's confirming it with three independent methods. He's explaining exactly what the global climate models are doing that get the erroneous results, and how it's reinforced over time, and how it just doesn't explain what's happened to the climate in the last few years. The models using the proper parameters on climate sensitivity, 4.5, and the proper aerosol levels, and changes of aerosols over time. I mean, it comes out exactly to, it can explain the present climate system. And if the models are forced with having a couple parameters incorrect to cancel each other out, then they get the same result all the time. But they openly admitted to not being able to explain what happened in the last few years with, the UN IPCC models. And again, I mentioned the Earth is getting darker. I mean, you could look at Hansen even includes a plot of megatons of sulfur dioxide emitted over time, and the aerosol emissions were strongest from about 1970 to 2005. Then they started to drop, especially over mainland China, in sort of 2005 on, or slightly before that. And then they dropped significantly in the maritime shipping fuels. And he also points out that the aerosol release has a big difference as to where it's released in the background concentration. So aerosols in over the ocean in pristine marine air, where there's very few cloud condensation nuclei, can have an enormous effect at very low levels. Whereas if you reduce aerosols in that environment from the shipping fuels, you have an enormous effect on the albedo or reflectivity of the Earth. That you have a lot fewer clouds. The Earth is a darker place, as the albedo data shows. He gives an albedo curve showing that drop, which I mentioned previous. So Hansen builds up a completely consistent picture on what is happening. And I'm thankful that he did move out to the country. He's returned to live much closer to Colombia. university where he does his work, and he's training young people to carry on his work. I mean, he's getting up there in age, so it's very important that his work continue when he's no longer able to do it. So that's very encouraging. So I would, if you play poker, I would go all in on Hansen any day of the week.
Okay, those who were watching didn't know you'd be getting betting tips, but you've just gotten one that I would endorse. When you pointed out the sort of the dynamic of he releases a paper and then it gets criticized and then the sort of the paper goes away. This is not just Paul Beckwith saying this. This is Jim Hansen himself saying this. He's the only scientist I know that actually includes in his papers his personal reflections, and maybe because he's at has a certain level of prestige that he's able to do that. But in this particular paper, he actually says that he says that he was accused after the last two papers of exaggerating, of mistakes, of oversimplifying, of being outside the mainstream. And he said he believes it's a result of those criticisms, as you said, Paul, that is one of the reasons why the paper doesn't get the attention of the public that it needs to. And that even though you and I and Peter, I think it's fair to say, are also white males or so, we're certainly not in the clique that is critical of Jim Hansen and his colleagues. So with that, I want to turn it back to Peter.
Yeah, thanks, sir. I want to say that, all the scientists, everybody should be well aware that James Hansen is right. And that's because the IPCC assessment stated that CO2 emissions, the changes in CO2 emissions, sorry, the changes in sulfate emissions. So this is from the sixth assessment of the IPCC. The changes in the sulfate emissions have a slightly larger contribution to global surface warming than CO2 emissions. So, I mean, the IPCC has stated that, so everybody should be well aware of it. So I want to go back about 10 years because James Hansen has been trying to communicate this whole thing for a long, long time. And it was about 10 years ago that in one of his many excellent PowerPoint communications to the public, which he certainly was putting out on a regular basis, and of course they were all excellent, he introduced what he called the Faustian bargain and with a fancy acceleration of the devil and one thing and another. And he explained the Faustian bargain was that we, at the time, like years ago, were ignoring the danger of the cooling of aerosols, which at some time in the future we would have to unmask. It's been unmasked now because of improvement of air pollution. That was always predicted. And of course, it has to be unmasked because we have to phase out the fossil fuel industry, right? That's pretty huge. He mentioned a really interesting paper in this particular paper, which was that in 1992, there was a paper published which basically said exactly the same thing, said that aerosol emissions cooling was approximately balancing CO2 emissions warming. So the scientists, I have to say, from my understanding, the scientists have not ever attracted a great deal of concern and attention to the aerosol issue. And that's because and I've argued this with climate experts, that's because they were projecting that the slowing down or stopping the aerosols would only have a temporary effect. It would only have a blip of an increase, which wouldn't last very long at all. Well, that's never made sense to me. I think it's pretty obvious that if you have a warming influence and a cooling influence long term and continually, if you remove the cooling influence, you're going to have an increase of warming and it's going to continue to affect that continuously. And so James Hansen in this paper makes that very clear, very clear.
Thank you, Peter. And it is that Faustian bargain that he has, as you say, he came up with that term quite a while ago, and this paper here just reinforces I guess you could call it even the tragic nature of that bargain, that the more we reduce certain kinds of air pollution, the more temperatures go up, and it's an unfortunate aspect of the natural world and the atmospheric world that we live in right now. Well, as we wrap up today, I want to thank our guests, but I want to be able to speak about one other section of the paper very briefly that really heartens him, I think it's fair to say. And that is, and I suspect we'll be talking more about this on the Climate Emergency Forum, the recent ruling by the International Court of Justice last month that basically said two things: that nations absolutely have an obligation to address climate change. Unambiguously, strong, clear, not hedged language, not with 15 different unless this or unless that. But and also very significantly, they have an obligation to work with other nations to do that, which of course we know it's a collective action problem. One nation, no matter how great their efforts or how poor their efforts, is not all that significant, though some are more significant than others because of their size. But we need to work together. And while this decision is advisory, it's highly likely to be cited many times in legislative debates in parliaments all over the world, in briefs that are filed by attorneys on behalf of young people and others in countries all over the world. So let's not minimize this. You know, it's not a magic wand, and every president and premier and around the world will not change their course because this came out in the very short run. But it's extremely important. And as Jim Hansen mentions, he prepared testimony. Unfortunately, it was not able to be allowed because he was on behalf of, I believe it was the government of Mauritius. From when he prepared the testimony until he was ready to give it, that government of Mauritius was no longer in office. But nonetheless, he did give that testimony in a press conference, along with his longtime attorney, Dan Galpern, who we've had on this show, along with Dr. Hansen. Jim is pretty convinced, as he says in the paper, that it did have an impact, that the number of the judges read his testimony, and clearly they followed it. So if there's not enough reasons already to give our hats off and our thanks and our enormous gratitude to Jim Hansen for a lifetime of service, here's yet another reason that Jim Hansen had a significant influence positively on what could be one of the major court decisions of this decade and beyond. So with that, I want to thank, as always, Peter Carter and Paul Beckwith. I want to urge you to like this program, to subscribe to our channel. The more people that subscribe, the more the algorithm presents Climate Emergency Forum throughout the enormous YouTube ecosystem. So that's very important to us. We'd like you to tell your friends and your neighbors and your colleagues about the Climate Emergency Forum. We are one of the few, if not the only channel that focuses just on the climate emergency. And with that, as always, we'll be happy to see you and eager to see you next week. Thanks so much.